General Hospital will reveal Drew had no idea that his decision to collaborate with Sidwell had placed him in a more dangerous position than he had ever anticipated. Initially, he believed he was entering a mutually beneficial agreement, one that would allow him to build a secure future with Willow without interference from the unpredictable forces of Port Charles. However, what he failed to realize was that Sidwell was holding a deadly secret, undeniable proof that Drew had been responsible for the catastrophic explosion at Sonny's apartment. Drew couldn't clearly recall the details of that night, but Sidwell had all the evidence needed to prove that he had been the one to carry out the attack. Whether it was a distorted memory or a moment of weakness that Sidwell had exploited, the facts were damning. A carefully edited surveillance video, meticulously falsified records, and an intricate trail of manipulated proof all pointed directly at him. It was airtight, leaving Drew with no room for denial, no possibility of escaping the reality Sidwell had constructed. On top of that, the threats were relentless. Sidwell had made it clear, any attempt to defy him would lead to immediate exposure. The implications were terrifying. If the truth, or even Sidwell's version of it, were revealed, Drew wouldn't just lose everything he had worked for, he would lose the future he had envisioned for himself and Willow. He would become a pariah in Port Charles, condemned for a crime he couldn't even remember committing. Faced with no other option, Drew had no choice but to become Sidwell's puppet, trapped in a web of coercion that he had never seen coming. The moment he had thought he was in control, he realized, Sidwell had been the one pulling the strings all along. Everything had started with what seemed like a calculated plan, one that, in Drew's mind, was entirely within his control. The objective had been simple, force Sonny off the docks to make way for the Esplanade project. With the right pressure and a few well-placed maneuvers, Drew believed he could push Sonny into a position where he had no choice but to relinquish control. He had weighed the risks, measured his options, and convinced himself that he could handle any complications that arose. But what he had failed to anticipate was just how much Sidwell had already manipulated the game before Drew even stepped onto the board. The explosion had changed everything. In an instant, the situation had escalated from a calculated business move to an irreversible catastrophe. The fire, the destruction, it had not just been a warning shot or a show of force. It had been devastating. The moment Drew learned that Michael had been caught in the blast, suffering injuries so severe that he had to be airlifted to Germany for treatment, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about business anymore. Someone had been gravely hurt, someone close to him, someone who should have never been involved. And suddenly, the weight of what had happened became unbearable. Drew found himself trapped in a spiral of doubt, questioning every step he had taken leading up to that night. He had no clear recollection of placing the bomb, no distinct memory of setting the plan into motion. But then again, his memories weren't exactly reliable. The gaps, the uncertainty, was it simply stress clouding his judgment, or had Sidwell deliberately manipulated him into believing a false reality? Had he been drugged? Hypnotized? Had Sidwell orchestrated everything so masterfully that Drew had unknowingly followed his orders without even realizing it? None of it mattered anymore. Whether Drew had physically placed the bomb himself or whether Sidwell had somehow orchestrated it behind his back, the end result was the same: Sidwell had all the leverage. The so-called partnership between them had never been equal. Sidwell had never truly needed Drew to be a willing accomplice. All he had needed was the illusion of Drew's involvement, and now he had it wrapped up in an airtight case. He had fabricated the perfect trap, an edited surveillance video, altered documents, a manufactured paper trail that all pointed to Drew as the sole perpetrator of the attack. Whether the evidence was real or not didn't matter, what mattered was that it was convincing enough to ruin Drew completely. Sidwell had made it clear, resistance was futile. If Drew even considered breaking free from his grasp, the truth, at least the version Sidwell had carefully constructed, would come to light. And the fallout would be catastrophic. Drew would lose everything. His family, his freedom, the life he had tried so desperately to build. If he tried to fight it, he would end up in prison, condemned as the man who had nearly killed Michael. Even worse, he would be labeled a traitor, someone who had willingly turned against Sonny and his own people for his own gain. With every move now being dictated by Sidwell, Drew found himself caught in a suffocating web, a pawn in a game where he had no control. The irony was bitter. He had stepped into this deal believing he held the upper hand, believing he could manipulate circumstances to benefit himself. But in the end, he had been the one manipulated, backed into a corner where the only way out was complete submission. He wasn't just working with Sidwell anymore. He was owned by him. Sidwell's ambitions stretched far beyond simply removing Sonny from the docks. That had been only the beginning, a small step in a much larger, more insidious scheme. His true objective required Drew to take increasingly dangerous actions, not just against Sonny, but against others in Port Charles who stood in the way of Sidwell's growing influence. This wasn't about business anymore, it was about power, control, and a relentless pursuit of domination over the city's key players. And Drew, whether he liked it or not, had become an indispensable pawn in that game. At first, Drew had tried to convince himself that if he did what Sidwell wanted, if he played along just long enough to help him achieve his immediate goals, he would be free. He had clung to the belief that Sidwell was simply using him as a means to an end, and that once Sonny was out of the picture and the Esplanade project was secured, Sidwell would loosen his grip and allow him to walk away. But that had been nothing more than wishful thinking, a desperate attempt to justify his own involvement in something he knew, deep down, was spiraling out of his control. Sidwell was not a man who let go. He was a serpent, slowly coiling around Drew, tightening his grip with every passing day. The more Drew complied, the deeper he was pulled in. And whenever the slightest hint of rebellion flickered within him, Sidwell was quick to extinguish it with a chilling reminder: he held all the cards. If Drew even thought about defying him, the evidence would be released. One anonymous tip, one carefully placed piece of information, and Drew's entire life would implode in an instant. It wasn't just his own fate that hung in the balance. Sidwell made sure he understood that. The threats weren't limited to Drew alone. If he stepped out of line, the consequences would extend far beyond him. Willow, Scout, everyone he cared about, would be caught in the fallout. Sidwell painted a vivid picture of what that would look like: Willow watching helplessly as the man she loved was dragged away in handcuffs, Scout growing up with the knowledge that her father had been branded a criminal, a terrorist. And Sidwell didn't stop there. He knew exactly where to strike, exactly which buttons to press. Drew had seen what men like Sidwell were capable of. He had been in war zones, he had faced enemies who had no regard for human life. But there was something uniquely terrifying about the way Sidwell operated. He didn't just threaten, he orchestrated, manipulated, planted seeds of doubt and fear until his victims were trapped in a prison of their own making. He didn't need to resort to brute force, he had crafted a psychological cage, and Drew was locked inside it. There was no negotiating, no reasoning with Sidwell. Drew had to comply, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. His hands were tied, his options were gone, and with every passing moment, he felt himself slipping further into the darkness Sidwell had dragged him into. The worst part was knowing that there was no end in sight. The more he obeyed, the more Sidwell demanded. It was never enough. Drew wasn't just working for Sidwell, he was owned by him. And the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. Those around Drew had begun to notice the changes in him. At first, it was subtle, small shifts in his demeanor that could be easily dismissed as stress or exhaustion. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. Willow, more than anyone, felt the growing distance between them. The man who had once been her source of stability and warmth now seemed increasingly withdrawn, his mind constantly elsewhere. He was tense, distracted, and more often than not, absent. He would disappear for long stretches without a reasonable explanation, returning home looking haunted, as if he were carrying the weight of something he couldn't put into words. She tried to reach him, to ask if something was wrong, but he always had a way of brushing it off, empty reassurances, vague excuses about work, anything to keep her from prying too deeply. Carly, too, sensed that something was off. She had known Drew long enough to recognize when he was keeping something from her. His usual confidence had been replaced with an edge of nervousness, his once certain movements now tinged with hesitation. It was subtle, but Carly knew how to read people. She watched as he avoided certain conversations, as he hesitated before answering questions, as he seemed to measure every word before speaking. It wasn't like him. He was hiding something, but what? And why? She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew it was serious. Sonny, despite having no concrete evidence, felt the shift as well. His instincts, sharpened over years of dealing with betrayal and deception, told him that something wasn't right. He had learned to trust those instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. Drew was acting differently, moving differently, looking at him differently. There was a tension there, an unease that hadn't been there before. Sonny had seen it too many times to ignore. Drew was tangled up in something, and whatever it wasn't good. Then there was Michael, the one person who had been closest to the tragedy, the only one who could remember even fragments of the explosion that had nearly cost him his life. His memories were still hazy, incomplete, but something wasn't sitting right with him. At first, he had accepted the official explanation, assuming it was nothing more than a tragic accident or a calculated attack on Sonny. But as time passed, pieces of that night started to surface in his mind, and they didn't fit the narrative he had been given. Little details, flashes of something just outside his reach. The sound of a voice. A silhouette. A fleeting moment of recognition before everything went black. It gnawed at him. There was something about the way it had all happened, something about the aftermath that felt wrong. And as he started to put those pieces together, a thought crept into his mind, one that he wasn't ready to say out loud just yet. But if it was true, if his suspicions were even remotely accurate, then the consequences would be far more devastating than he had imagined. Drew was at the center of it all, and the more everyone around him started to see the cracks in his carefully maintained facade, the closer they came to uncovering the truth he was so desperately trying to keep buried. Drew kept trying to convince himself that he could find a way out of this situation, that if he was careful enough, if he played his cards right, he could keep the secret buried and escape detection. He told himself that Sidwell was using him as a temporary pawn, that there would come a time when he could break free from the man's grasp. But deep down, he knew better. Sidwell had no intention of ever letting him go. Every time Drew attempted to push back, to carve out even the smallest bit of autonomy, Sidwell tightened the noose around his neck. There was no room for negotiation, no moment of weakness on Sidwell's part. The man had meticulously crafted a system of control that kept Drew firmly under his thumb. Each time Drew hesitated or showed signs of defiance, Sidwell responded with new threats, ones that grew increasingly severe, targeting not just Drew, but the people he loved. And it wasn't just words. Sidwell made good on his warnings in small, calculated ways that reminded Drew of the consequences of disobedience. A quiet reminder slipped into conversation about Willow's hospital shift schedule, a casually mentioned detail about Scout school pickup time, things that Sidwell should have had no way of knowing, yet somehow did. The message was clear: Sidwell was watching, always watching. And if Drew even considered stepping out of line, the fallout would be swift and merciless. With each passing day, the assignment Sidwell handed down became riskier, pushing Drew further into dangerous territory. It wasn't just about real estate and business deals anymore. It was about sabotaging competitors, eliminating obstacles, and carrying out actions that Drew never would have considered before. But Sidwell had him cornered. The evidence he held was damning, and Drew knew that if it ever saw the light of day, there would be no coming back from it. Still, he tried to believe that he could outmaneuver Sidwell, that there was some way to reclaim control before it was too late. But each time he thought he had found a crack in Sidwell's armor, a way to turn the tables, the man proved just how little power Drew actually had. Sidwell wasn't just using him. He owned him. And with every step Drew took, he was sinking deeper into a quicksand of manipulation, one that would swallow him whole if he didn't find a way out soon. Drew had once been a soldier, a former Navy SEAL trained to face the harshest conditions and the most formidable enemies. He had fought in war zones, survived life-or-death missions, and endured situations where split-second decisions determined whether he lived or died. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where enemies wore uniforms, where the lines between right and wrong were clear. This was a war of deception, manipulation, and control, a game where the rules were constantly shifting, and the enemy was one he couldn't simply eliminate with brute force. Sidwell wasn't an opponent he could take down with sheer strength or tactical precision. He was something far worse, a devil in a businessman's suit, a master puppeteer who didn't need to fire a single shot to destroy everything Drew held dear. One whispered word, one well-placed piece of evidence, and Sidwell could bring Drew's entire world crashing down. That kind of power was far more terrifying than any battlefield Drew had ever faced. The worst part was knowing that there was no easy way out. If he continued down this path, obeying Sidwell's every command, he would lose himself entirely, becoming nothing more than a hollow shell of the man he once was. Every mission, every crime he was forced to commit would strip away another piece of his soul, leaving behind only the version of Drew that Sidwell had molded, a man who existed only to serve his master's will. But if he tried to walk away, if he dared to defy Sidwell, the consequences would be catastrophic. The life he had built, the people he loved, Willow, Scout, even Michael, who had nearly died because of all this, they would all suffer for his mistakes. He was trapped in a nightmare with only one way out. He had to find a way to defeat Sidwell before Sidwell destroyed him. But how could he win a war when his opponent held all the cards, controlled all the pieces, and had already set the board in his favor?